Haven't seen a spooky stories thread in a while, so I'll start. One of my favorite parts of this board was reading spook shit. Let's bring it back. Me, 14 years old. Visiting redneck aunt and cousins in Oklahoma, middle of nowhere. Dad and younger sister came with me. So stupid, they stopped educating their kids. Cousin my age is one of the dumbest people I've ever met, etc. First 2 days of the visit are completely normal, if not a little boring. Aunt is obsessed with guns. Keeps a loaded one in every room. What the fuck, .jpg. Find it weird, but think it's just redneckery. Day 3 rolls around. Myself, my cousin, and some of his friends do some fishing and swimming in a small pond near the house. We swim until it gets dark. Just teenagers fucking around, having a good time. Keep hearing noises from the tree line at the other end of the pond. Faint smell of something really bad. Like a carcass blowing its fumes downwind. Cousin says it's just deer. Okay, LOL. We pack into his friend's geo-tracker and go back to cousin's place for the night. Bad smell follows us back to aunt's place. Her house seems really restless that night. I was kept up most of the night hearing them from the barn. Wake up at noon to an empty house. Bad smell is gone. So was everyone else. Cousin went to help with his stepdad's farm work. Dad went with his sister and my sister to a mall. Nobody woke me up. What is ill due to 1 bar of service on my phone. Fuck it. Laced up my boots, decided I wanted to see more of my aunt's 15-acre property, since I'd only really been in her house for the first few days. I'm done green texting, now fuck that shit. It was a small body of water pretty close to my aunt's house in her front yard, and just past that was about 80 yards of trees, followed by a clearing that her horses usually stood in during the day. I set my sights on walking some of the trails I could see just inside the tree line, but the way the trees separated my aunt's yard from the clearing was weird, because it connected to a forest that spread across multiple properties in the area. Most of them were just being sat on by realtors and not being used, so I wasn't too worried about being caught by some redneck moron with a gun. Full disclosure, though trespassing on random property is probably not the smartest idea. I kept following one of the faint trails deeper and deeper into the trees for about 45 minutes or so. My playlist kept me company on my nature walk. It was pretty nice, until I started noticing the bones peppering the dirt besides the trail. At first, it was only a few. So few that I didn't even register that I kept seeing more the further I went down this path. They weren't human bones or anything spooky like that, so I figured, probably just some animals' leftovers, and kept trekking onwards. I used to hike a lot from ages 6 to 12, so seeing animal bones on the trail wasn't that weird. Pretty normal actually. What wasn't normal, however, was the fact that the deeper I went into these trees, the more bones were riddled alongside the trail, not even just along it, but all around me in those woods. I pulled out one of my earbuds to actual dead silence when I started really thinking about what I was seeing around me. I immediately yanked the other one out when I realized I couldn't hear anything. Not the rustle of leaves in the wind, not the singing of birds, not a distant branch snapping. Dead fucking silence. I don't normally listen to music at higher volumes, so I know it wasn't just my ears adjusting to a lack of sound. It was really quiet out there. At this point, my heart was jumping out of my chest. Dead silence is usually a pretty bad sign while you're alone in the sticks in the middle of the day. Not only was it silent, but I noticed something weird about the bones too. Most of them were laying together, like the animals had keeled over and just rotted, but a few were tied together with what looked like sinew, really old sinew. The further I walked, the more I kept looking, the more of these little bundles of bones stuck out to me. And they weren't just on the ground anymore either. Some of them were tied to tree branches, some of them were tied to animal skeletons on the ground, and a few errant ones stuck out of distant tree hollows. In spite of everything my guts were telling me, I kept following the trail. Partially out of boredom, as I really didn't have much else to do, and partially, again out of morbid curiosity, where I was at first a bit worried that I was walking on a hunting animal's trail, like a mountain lion. But I convinced myself otherwise with logic, that there weren't any mountains around here, and my aunt probably wouldn't keep horses if there were signs of some predatory animal stalking around her property. I knew my cousin's older brother had a hobby of whittling bones and antlers, so I convinced myself that the bone bundles were probably just targets for shooting that he'd forgotten to take down before moving out of her house the year prior. What actually convinced me to turn around and head back to my aunt's place was the fact that the breeze picked up briefly, and I caught an awful smell. like something was rotting upwind. It was a really acrid smell that I swear burnt some of my nose hairs off. That and the prickling I felt all over my body. Shit had me so weirded out that I was covered in goosebumps before I even realized it. I grabbed one of the bone bundles I saw lying next to the skeletons that were all around me and walked right the fuck back out of there. By the time I got back, it was around 3 p.m. and everyone but my cousin was back in the house. Not much of note happened, but I remember asking my aunt if her son, the older cousin, had ever made targets or anything like the bundles I saw out in the woods. She was so confused, so I fished around in my bag and pulled out the little figure made out of bones, and she literally had no clue. Weirded me the fuck out again. Fast forward to the next day, and I'm asking my cousin about the trail and the bones, trying to see if he'd maybe go with me to do some target practice on the bones. Now, when I say this kid was as stupid as a box of rocks, I mean it. My aunt pulled him out of school in 5th grade and repeatedly lied to the state, telling them that she was homeschooling him. She was concerned about wokeness or whatever the fuck. So I'm telling him about what I saw on the trail, and he's confused as hell too. Said that he's followed the trail, but really only to the property line, because his mom said she'd tear him a new one if she had to pay charges for trespassing, or worse, had to take him to the hospital with a bullet wound. I called him a pussy, and determined to prove me wrong, we set out back down the trail the next day. After about an hour of walking, we made it back to where I started seeing the bones. Although it wasn't nearly as quiet this time around, my cousin, without telling me, had brought a small slingshot along on his walk, and decided now was a great time to whip it out and start shooting the little bone figures. Hearing the crack of the bones shattering from the rock he sent towards the first one nearly made me jump out of my skin. Mainly because he had been walking behind me the whole time. So we kept walking for about 10 more minutes, deeper into the woods, when he noticed something and pointed it out to me. Just far enough ahead that I could barely make it out was a concrete mound in the ground. Needless to say, we were running towards whatever this thing was. Eventually, we got close enough to see that it wasn't so much of a mound as it was a concrete box with a door. All around the perimeter were more of those little bone figures. We were psyched to have found this. While the schoolyard talk of a hidden bunker in my cousin's backyard was filling our heads and leaving our mouths, we thoroughly investigated the thing. From a distance, we couldn't really make out the markings on it. Getting up close, however, it was obvious that we found an old tornado shelter. This thing had taken a beating too. There were chips all over the concrete. Chips and marks from all sorts of animals, hoof marks, claw marks, everything and anything. Raccoon paws, cloven hooves, etc. Shit was really weird. The weirdest part though was the door. It wouldn't budge. The both of us took turns trying to wrench it open, using rocks to try and pry the thing open, but it didn't move. Its rusty visage felt almost like it was mocking us. What use was there for a tornado shelter that you can't even get into? My cousin, in his genius, decided that the best course of action was to line up a few cans he had emptied on top of the thing and shoot them with a slingshot. I stood by him, rolling a little effigy I'd kept with me around in my hand, and waited for him to get done fucking around with the slingshot, until he shot the door. I don't understand how, or why, but it rang out like a fucking gunshot. We both jumped about 10 feet in the air and nearly pissed ourselves with how loud that shit was. While we were looking at each other like, what the fuck, he noticed something over my shoulder. I turned to meet the direction of his gaze and saw it. Hanging from one of the lower branches on a tree about 30 feet out was the skin of some animal. My cousin said it was a deer hide. At this point, he scared shitless that some hunter had skinned a deer that had been killed around here and that we'd get caught for trespassing, so we basically booked it out of there. Probably ran for like 15 minutes before we slowed down to jog, and then eventually to a brisk walk. The bad smell didn't come back until later that night, when we were already headed back from our walk for a few hours. He didn't tell his mom how far we went into the woods, mainly due to him not wanting to get his ass handed to him with a belt. We had a pretty normal rest of our evening, until around 8 p.m. My aunt loved sitting around the fire pit on her deck right out front, so there we were that evening, roasting marshmallows and shooting the shit with each other, having a good time. When my cousin tells me he wants to show me something, his mom instantly spoiled the surprise and told me he was going to show me a deer in the clearing by her house. See, he did this thing pretty frequently, where he'd climb a tree at the edge of the pasture and just wait until they'd come and graze at night. just after the sun would come down. Said he'd use that branch crook as a hunting platform once he got his own gun. So we went to his tree spot to watch some deer that evening. We sat and waited about 15 minutes before we noticed a few deer walking into the opening. But something was wrong. You could feel it in the air. How wrong that something was. You could smell it too. He whispered something to me about how it might rain soon, because of the almost ozone-esque smell mixed with something else entirely was just filling our noses. Something inside me knew better though. The rotting smell was back, and even worse than when I'd been hiking. Its pungent odor made my head spin, and my cousin even gagged a few times. It smelled like rotting meat, iron, and something pretty similar to ozone. We were both whispering really quietly to each other while waiting, but had shut right the fuck up when we saw the deer. Now, they'd been out in the clearing for a few minutes. He said something about the smell that was pretty obviously on both of our minds. Dude, it smells like shit. Let's go back inside. So we did. We climbed down the tree, hitting the ground as softly as we could possibly manage. None of the deer seemed to notice or care, with the exception of one. One of them had been shambling a bit and walked over with its herd, and he had told me it was probably just injured. I shit you not, this injured deer stood right up on its hind legs and fucking stared us down. It didn't move. It didn't even look like it was breathing. It just stared right into my fucking soul. My cousin, in his vast redneck intelligence, said fuck it, and started yelling and waving his arms while running towards the herd. All of them scattered, like a handful of marbles dropped onto tile floor, all except for the injured one. It stood exactly where it had been standing for the past minute and a half, and seemed completely unfazed by my cousin's genius attempt to scare them off. At this point, I'm shitting bricks, sweating bullets, and quaking like an aspen in the wind, and he's on the same page as me. I tell him, we should go back inside, and he says, yeah, good idea. We both walked the 10 minutes back towards my aunt's house, looking over our shoulders every minute or so. By the time we got back, my aunt and sister had retired into the house for the night. The bad smell never did go away, even after we went inside. My cousin still thought it was an injured animal acting weird. He told me it could be an odd case of chronic wasting disease. I knew he was just bullshitting to put our minds at ease, but I still had a lot more trouble getting to sleep that night. The dream I had was crazy and vivid too. I dreamt that I was in my neighborhood at home in the middle of the night, walking with my older sister and her friends, one of whom I had never met before. We had snuck out and we were looking to score some pot from her dealer. We keep walking and following the GPS on her phone, but the streets keep shifting, like you'd walk one way and somehow end up where you started. Not only that, but there were no cars on the road. I say, fuck the pot, let's go home, and she says, no. So I say, okay, well, I'm going home, and start walking. I round one corner, and the street she was just on vanishes, like gone without a trace. If it wasn't obvious to me before, the dream really became a nightmare then. As hard as I tried to get back to my house, I couldn't find the street I lived on. The harder I looked, the more I realized I was being stalked by a man in the distance. At first, I could barely see him. He moved quicker than any human should be able to. Around the third time I had looked back to see him. He was close enough that I could tell he was just standing still. He was too far to make out his face, but I could still tell that he wasn't moving. Or not while I was looking at him anyways. And then there it was again. That fucking smell. The rotting flesh and iron and electricity that penetrated my nostrils and sinuses. At this point, I'm running down the streets, but dream running, so not even getting anywhere that quickly. Heart is pounding because a random man is following me in the dead of the night, and I'm all alone. Eventually, he gets close enough that I can hear him in the distance, speaking absolute gibberish in my cousin's voice. He's probably got chronic wasting disease or something, I don't know. Anon, it's got chronic wasting disease. Anon wasting. Hunting, Anon, etc. After a certain point, the man just kept repeating my name in varying pitches. It scared the shit out of me. Looking back on it now, I still get the heebie-jeebies. I woke up around 3:45 in the morning to use the bathroom, also partially to avoid going back to sleep. The instant I turned the lights on in the bathroom, I heard something heavy booking it away from the front door. My aunt's house isn't really a sizable building by any means. probably around 800 square feet. So my dad has to sleep in my aunt's trailer hooked up to her truck for when she travels with the horses. My half-awake state, I think, what the hell is my dad doing out there? And pass back out for another few hours. No spooky dreams this time though. Wake up in the morning and everything seems normal, although I'm spooked from the events of the previous night. My cousin goes, "I know what'll cheer you up," and tells me we're going swimming again. Personally, I love swimming, and if you've ever been in the middle of nowhere in the American South, you know exactly how miserable the heat is during the summer. Hence why swimming was so great for the summer months. We loaded back into his friend's geo-tracker and headed up the road off our property for a bit before turning down a rough trail into some trees. The truck actually got stuck heading up there, but with a few minutes of pushing, we were back on our way to the new swimming area. They were hyping it up, talking about how much fun it'll be. I'm confused because although I like swimming, whatever they had planned couldn't be that great. I was very wrong. We drove through one of the neighbors' pastures on an off-roading track, careful not to scare the cows we were heading past. When they parked and told me that we had arrived, I was confused as hell because we were walking uphill. As we keep walking, my cousin breaks out into a sprint and keeps running full speed towards the crest of the hill until he jumps and plunged over the edge of the horizon. The splash that followed answered my question immediately. They had brought me cliff diving. It wasn't a huge cliff, probably only about a 35-foot drop, but nonetheless, it was great. The shitty part was climbing back up. It was a pretty sheer climb up some jagged rocks and involved a bit of caution and some prickly bushes that were in the area they had over the years carved out a trail in. I decided that after about 2 hours of this that I was going back to the truck, mainly because my feet got cut up by multiple climbs back up to the jumping spot. I have no shame in admitting my skin is that of a city slickers, so I went back towards the truck to change into dry clothes and check my phone. Although I didn't have any texts, my cousin's phone had a few missed calls from his mother, and a slew of texts. I call him over to look and he's freaking out. His mom says one of her horses got out, vanished into thin air pretty much, and she thinks he's responsible since he feeds the horses in the morning. So he's freaking out because she's pissed that her horse is missing, and we all head back pretty much right away, while his mom was chewing him out for letting the horses get out. His friend went home, so now it's about 3 p.m. and he's out with his mom to look around the property for the missing horse. It's just gone. Not so much as a horseshoe was left behind. They kept looking until around the sun came down, and in that time, some weird stuff transpired. I haven't mentioned this yet because I don't like speaking ill of the dead, but my father was a pretty big alcoholic. He'd drink and drink until he blacked out, and there was no moving him or getting anything out of him once he was knocked out. About an hour after my aunt left with my cousin, my dad stumbled through her front door, drenched in sweat, half awake, and promptly collapsed on the couch that I'd been sleeping on for the past few nights of my visit. My aunt and cousin came home just before the sunset, and my aunt's really frustrated that her multiple thousand animal just dropped off the face of the earth. Naturally, she decided to leave the house for the evening and went to go spend the night at her boyfriend's place. Almost as soon as her truck left the driveway, the stomach-turning smell from before returned, and it was even stronger than it had ever been. Almost like when you stick your nose right up to the center of a flower and you get the full scope of its scent. That's the best way I could describe it. In the previous days we had experienced this, the iron smell was kinda off. Now the noxious odor was right up in our faces. We both recognized what the smell was. The iron smell was blood. I don't know how. Maybe it's because I was scared shitless, but it reeked like blood and rotting meat and fucking ozone. I don't know how. Maybe it's because I was scared shitless, but it reeked like blood and rotting meat and fucking ozone. Then the stomping began. What sounded like someone pacing around outside started up, and I swear to God, I heard it fucking whispering. My cousin is unfazed by these noises and tells me, "It's just our donkey. He gets out of his pen sometimes." I try to get him to hear the whispering, but we couldn't hear shit over my father's deviated septum snores. He calmed me down by getting some pot from his older brother's old study, and we smoked a joint to chill out. By the time we finished it, it was about 10 p.m. and I was pretty tired. The whispering and pacing had chilled out a bit too, to the point I'd convinced myself I was just hearing shit. So I said my goodnights to him and my sister, and decided I was gonna retire to the now open queen-size bed inside the trailer. I opened the front door to my aunt's house, and immediately heard a crack. I nearly jumped out of my skin until I realized it was because I had stepped on something. I looked down under where I set my foot and found a bundle of bones, shattered by the weight of my body. In my high and exhausted state, I thought to myself, "Ooh, I must have dropped this. Whoops, lol." Swept the pieces off the doormat with my shoe and kept heading towards the trailer, although it still smelled really, really bad. Whatever was doing the thumping had run off into the night as soon as I'd opened the door, which is partially what convinced me in that moment that it was a donkey, because he'd do this during the day, so I was a bit less worried about some weird thing out in the night. It was only after I was in the trailer for a few minutes that I realized why my father had decided to sleep on the couch that night. The air conditioning was shut off inside the trailer and it was sweltering, so I'm trying to get comfortable in there, laying in just my underwear, trying to load up a YouTube video to fall asleep to, when I heard it again. The pacing noises come back, and they were louder than before. All I could smell in the trailer was my own sweat mixing with a horrible odor coming from just outside the door. Suffice to say I was sweating like crazy, partially because of the temperature, and partially because I was being followed by something big and scary. I was trying to think logically about what could be out there, why the donkey might be pacing around the trailer, when it started knocking and fucking speaking. At first, it was in my cousin's voice, just saying my name over and over, asking me to let it in, asking me to stop hiding in there. I laid as still as a corpse on that mattress, but it didn't matter. It kept knocking and kept knocking, asking me to come out. I texted my cousin and got no response. I called him. No response. He was asleep. Whatever was out there must have heard the dial tone because it got pissed. Really pissed. The pacing sped up to the point where it almost sounded like multiple people were outside the trailer, and the banging on the walls and door were so intense I could see the walls reverberating from the repeated impacts. I almost thought it was throwing itself into the trailer because the whole fucking thing was shaking with every hit. It went on for what felt like an eternity until it subsided just as quickly as it began. I heard the pacing stop just to the right of my head and remembered that there was a window with a curtain in the little loft area where the bed was situated, directly to my right, where cool air had been floating in through the netting on the window between the cracks of the curtain. It got warm and foul, stagnated to the point where I nearly choked. I'd been so preoccupied watching the door and making sure its lock didn't come undone that I didn't even notice the curtains had a crack in them, and the lack of cool air flowing through drew my attention. I turned my head to look between the crack when I saw my aunt's horse staring back at me with a singular, bloodshot, sunken, very human eye. I didn't have to guess as to what that was out there anymore. It was a Skinwalker. I stopped a yelp from leaving my mouth, grit my teeth, and shut the window by grabbing the edge through the curtain as calmly as I could manage. And then I shut the gap in the curtains. This thing went into a fucking rampage. It was screaming in my cousin's voice, rocking the trailer with every hit. I honestly don't know if I pissed myself that night. The delirium of the heat exhaustion and the panic of one of those things being out there made my head feel like it was spinning like a top. I just know I sat in that trailer for fucking hours, listening to this thing trying its damnedest to drive me out of my sleeping accommodation until the sun came up. My phone had died at about 12 a.m. that night. I wish I had the foresight to record literally any of what had happened, but alas, I was a stupid teenager. At about 4:50 a.m., when the sun's rays first crested the horizon, the thing took off at light fucking speed. Seriously, I have no clue how I was able to move that fast. The bad smell receded from being overpoweredly acrid to being a faint note that hung in the air over my aunt's house. I immediately put on a pair of pants and shoes and tried to see if any evidence of the evening before had been left. I walked around the trailer about 20 times while shirtless before the exhaustion got the better of me, and went back in the trailer to pass out. I didn't sleep long, mainly because I had the same dream as the night previous. I was back home being stalked again. This dream was different though. The man was shaking with rage and heaving his shoulders up and down. He demanded that I give it back, in my aunt's voice, which scared the dickens out of me. I woke up around noon again, covered in sweat, wondering if I had just dreamed up the events of the night before. When I'd fully come to, I realized I was sleeping on something lumpy and uncomfortable in my pocket. I reached in tentatively to feel what was annoying me in my dreams. A bunch of smooth sticks met my fingers. The effigy was still in my pocket. I bolted upright, smacked my head on the ceiling of the trailer's loft, which sent me reeling back down for a few seconds. As I was waiting for my skull to stop throbbing, I put on the shirt I had laid on the ground the night before in an effort to get comfortable. I pretty much flew out the trailer door. Never before had I been so happy to be free of a space like that. I almost set my butt down on another one of those bone effigies, but caught myself at the last second. Instead, I scooped it up and put it in my pocket with the other one. I began walking back towards the house to tell my cousin what had transpired the previous evening, when I noticed another effigy, and another, yet again another. The first one I noticed around the house was directly under the window to my aunt's laundry room, and just to its left was one sitting right smack dab in the middle of the path beneath the door to her laundry room. Another under the front door, next to the one I'd broken the night prior. I walked all the way around her house and must have found 8 or 9 of the damn things. I walked through her front door, pushing past my dad, and went directly to my cousin's room. He was gone. My phone was still dead, so I just put it on the charger. While I waited for it to charge, I talked to my father to ask him if he knew where my cousin had went. He told me that at about 8 in the morning, his mother had taken him with her to go looking for the missing horse on their neighbor's property. I knew in my heart they weren't gonna find it. Not alive anyways. What I did next was probably the dumbest fucking thing I could think I ever could have done. I took a shower, put on some clean clothes, laced up my boots, and started back down the trail I had been so eagerly followed a few days prior. It made itself very clear in my dream. It wanted for something that I had taken for it to be given back. I still had its effigy. My father, in addition to alcoholism, was nigh amazing atheist levels of cringe, with how little he believed in the supernatural. I knew he wouldn't believe me if I answered him honestly, where I was going out the door, so I simply responded, "On a hike. I know now, you're ideally not supposed to walk directly into the territory of a predator, but what else could I do?" It was the only way I could think to curb the wrath of whoever had been out there. I started back down the trail and immediately noticed that it was dead silent before I even left her lawn. I was being stalked. The odor never really left alone on my walk. It was just present enough that the breeze would pick it up and I'd get assaulted nasally by the smell of blood and decay. With each step I took, moving ever forwards into the winding trees, the smell grew stronger. Every now and then I'd hear a distant scream, but never from the same location. It'd be way off to the right of me, or behind me the way I came. Eventually, I got back to the bones, back to where I'd found the effigies. The smell was vile and almost overpowering at this point. I knew I was there. I'd walked right into its domain, defenseless. I might as well have laid down on a silver platter and put an apple in my mouth. These things have a weird way of manipulating the woods they inhabit. What would have been an 100-minute walk into the tornado shelter in the woods became a 30-minute walk. Without distractions, it was obvious to me how much shorter the walk was this time around. It never wanted me to find this shelter in the first place, but I kept searching for a reason to be out there in my teenage hubris. As I kept walking closer to the shelter, the smell of blood became almost asphyxiating, and life would fill my head to the point where I could barely keep my balance. I never had a weak stomach, but the smell was too much. I dropped on my knees, dry heave, when I saw about 60 yards ahead of me, a decapitated, skinless horse was laying in the dirt, caked in bloody mud and its intestines hanging out. Hanging in the tree beside it was the horse's hide. My aunt's horse's hide. This time, I actually did vomit. I'm not normally squeamish, but I hate seeing people's pets get hurt. I hate seeing the dead even more. The combination of the overpowering smell and the visual of the slaughtered horse made my stomach give in to the nausea that had been nesting itself slowly into my mind. As I stood, wiping the bile from my lips, I remembered to take deep breaths in. As insulting to my senses as the air was, the oxygen helped gather my thoughts. I'm not a believer in Abrahamic faiths, but during the last 5 minutes of the walk to the shelter, I think I said about 100 different prayers. It's crazy how fear could influence you like that. On any other day, I would have been cursing God by 3 p.m. Only on that day did I beg for forgiveness and safety from him. My prayers must have been heard, because before I even registered it, I was staring directly at the shelter. The door was slightly cracked, and the urge to vomit was getting larger by the second. The smell wafting out the door genuinely gave me a migraine. I didn't want to open the door more than it had been. The last thing I wanted to do was piss the thing off while it was watching me. That, and I didn't want to see what it looked like under the animal skins. I screamed out into the air, "Take your fucking bones back. I'm sorry." Dropped the effigies I had gathered into my pockets, and sprinted as quickly as I could back down the trail. The path back was a blur of leaves and gnats as I ran with all my strength I could muster. I tripped once and heard a blood-curdling scream ring out behind me, which made me immediately launch back into my full sprint. By the time I made it back to my aunt's house, I was covered in cuts and bruises. I didn't even realize until the adrenaline wore off, but I dislocated a finger when I tripped. It hurt like hell, but I set it back in place. After about 15 minutes of running, the woods were no longer silent and the bad smell was gone. My cousin and aunt were home and everyone asked me why I looked like shit. I told them I had just tripped while hiking. I tried to tell my cousin what I'd seen and he laughed in my face saying, "You believe in skinwalkers? Come here." He led me outside and screamed the word skinwalker into the sky about 20 times. I winced, fearing some sort of retribution from the tree line, but nothing happened. No spooks ran at us, no shrieks, no smells. The birds didn't even quit singing. He just laughed and told me I'd been reading too many scary stories, and even got upset with me for trying to tell him I'd seen his aunt's horse. He said, "Who would do that to someone's horse and not even go through the effort of eating it?" I realized at this point that my words were falling on deaf ears. Nothing else of note really happened during the visit, but I made sure to sleep inside for the few days that were left of the trip before my father drove my sister and I back home. My cousin told me that he went back down the trail after we returned home, and there was no horse in the dirt like I said there was. There was just a shitty old tornado shelter with a door that wouldn't budge.